He thought he could bury her with accusations, Mike Huckabee calling Jasmine Crockett a fraud to her faith. Yet within minutes she opened scripture line by line and showed the nation that her fight was God's command. His power crumbled, her voice soared. What was the single truth Jasmine spoke that Huckabee could not escape? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The CNN studio blazed with white-hot lights, cameras swinging like weapons. Tonight was not a routine program, it was a duel. On the left, Mike Huckabee, former governor and Baptist preacher, adjusted his tie with the calm of a man who had preached 1,000 sermons. On the right, Jasmine Crockett, a young congresswoman and civil rights attorney, sat straight, her pen poised like a blade. Both carried the Bible in their past, but only one would walk out with its authority. The audience was split like a fault line. One side whispered certain Huckabee would humiliate her. The other side leaned forward, hungry to see Jasmine dismantle him. Every eye burned with anticipation. The air was electric like a courtroom moments before a verdict. Then the moderator's voice rang out sharp as a gavel. Tonight the question is not just politics, it is who truly understands the Bible. The battle had begun. The moderator's words still hung in the air when Huckabee leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table like a preacher gripping the pulpit. He wasted no time. Jasmine Crockett, Huckabee thundered, has twisted faith into nothing more than a political weapon. His words cut through the studio like a blade, shaking the silence into ripples of murmurs. He raised his hand toward her, not pointing, but accusing, his palm open like a verdict being handed down. She does not follow the eternal truths. She exploits them. She has turned the sacred into a prop for her agenda. The crowd shifted uneasily, half nodding in agreement, half holding their breath as the charge echoed through the air. He pressed harder, refusing to slow his momentum. "She stands here defending abortion," Huckabee declared, his voice dripping with moral outrage. "She defends same-sex marriage. She even hides behind so-called community healthcare programs as if government handouts were the gospel itself." Each accusation was flung like a stone, hurled into a courtroom, loud and deliberate. He made sure each word struck with force, pausing just long enough to let the sting settle before hurling the next. His face flushed with conviction, his fist striking the table once for emphasis, a preacher's cadence twisting into the rhythm of an attack. The audience reacted like a storm divided. A wave of claps and cheers rose from one side, sharp and triumphant, while the other side shook their heads, whispering angrily among themselves. The tension snapped like live wires sparking against steel, filling the air with heat and danger. Anderson Cooper glanced between them, his face taut, knowing the debate had already shifted into open combat. Every camera zoomed in tighter, catching sweat, catching fury, catching the collision of two worlds on the brink of eruption. Then Huckabee drove the knife deeper, turning directly to Jasmine, his finger cutting the air like a spear. "You speak about justice," he bellowed, his voice raw and booming, "but you do not know what biblical justice is." The words exploded, ricocheting through the studio, shaking even those who had applauded moments earlier. His voice carried finality, as if the trial had already been decided, as if her faith had already been judged unworthy. The charge was total, absolute, merciless. For Huckabee, this was the opening strike, the moment to establish dominance, to make Jasmine appear small before the weight of his authority. For the audience, it was an execution in progress, a one-sided storm battering the stage. The debate had only just begun, but Huckabee's intent was clear, to crush her spirit before she ever spoke a word. And in that moment, the air inside CNN's studio was so tight, so suffocating, it felt like the walls themselves were bracing for impact. The studio was still shaking from Huckabee's thunderous accusations when Jasmine finally moved. She did not raise her voice, she did not rush. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her pen resting on the table, her eyes steady. The silence stretched, and then she leaned forward, her tone calm but cutting. "Governor Huckabee," she asked, each word sharp as glass, in Matthew 25, "what does Jesus say about how we will be judged?" The question sliced through the roar of the room like a scalpel, simple but deadly precise. Huckabee blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. He shifted in his chair, fumbling for footing, his lips forming words that came out scattered. "Well, sheep and goats," he mumbled, trying to capture the image of judgment, but missing the substance. The power in his voice was gone, replaced by hesitation. The camera zoomed closer, catching the flicker of doubt, the crease forming on his forehead. The audience leaned in as if they sensed blood in the water, waiting for Jasmine's next move. She reached into her jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, pulling out a small worn Bible. The room tightened as she flipped the pages, the sound of paper turning amplified by the silence. Then her voice rang out clear and unwavering. "I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Every word landed like a hammer on steel. The studio froze. The sound of her reading seemed louder than Huckabee's sermon ever had. The effect was immediate and devastating. The crowd stopped breathing, eyes darting from Jasmine to Huckabee. The cameras cut to his face, his jaw slack, his smile gone, his hand twitching against the table. It was the look of a man suddenly cornered, stripped of his certainty. The silence was heavier than any applause, hanging like judgment itself. Jasmine lowered the Bible gently, her gaze unflinching. Her voice low but searing, delivered the final strike. Jesus did not mention abortion. He did not mention same-sex marriage. He only spoke about caring for the poor and the weak. The words echoed like a verdict, and in that instant the balance of power shifted completely. The storm Huckabee unleashed had met an unshakable wall, and the audience knew they had just witnessed a turning point. The last syllable of Jasmine's reading had barely faded when the recoil hit. Huckabee slammed his palm against the table, the crack echoing off the studio walls like a starter pistol. His eyes flashed as he leaned into the microphone and barked, "You cherry-picked the Bible," each word fired like a round. He jabbed the air, cutting across her line of sight as if to sever the moment. He surged forward again, voice rough and relentless, drowning the silence before it could crown her point. "You are dodging the core issues of morality," he shouted, riding the interruption like a wave he refused to let break. He did not yield. He kept slicing in breath, hard cadence, brutal intent on forcing her back into defense. The moderator lifted a hand, but Huckabee was already talking over the gesture, pushing volume over reason. Jasmine did not flinch. Her shoulders stayed level. Her gaze locked, her breathing slow. When the gap finally opened, she stepped through it without raising her voice. "It's not me choosing. Jesus chose this standard." She said the line clean as a knife's edge. The quiet that followed her words was tight, the kind that makes sound feel heavier when it returns. The audience fractured in an instant. From the right side came a burst of cheers and whistles, the sharp triumph of a home crowd sensing blood. From the left rose boos and shouted protests, hands waving faces, flushed a wall of heat rolling toward the stage. Security shifted at the aisles, not moving in, but ready eyes tracking the swell like lifeguards watching a rip current. Cameras punched tighter on Huckabee's jaw, then on Jasmine's stillness, bouncing between fury and control, like a metronome pounding a war tempo. In that thundering split, the debate shed its careful logic and became something raw, a contest of will and steadiness pressed under white-hot lights. The shouting had barely died when Jasmine leaned forward, her posture steady, her voice sharpened to a blade. She opened the Bible again, flipping through its thin pages with deliberate speed. When she spoke, it wasn't rage that carried her words, it was precision. Luke chapter 4, verse 18, she declared, her eyes locked on Huckabee like a hunter sighting prey. "Proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners." The words cracked through the studio like a gunshot. She tapped her pen once against the desk, a sound like a gavel. "Does that sound like silence to you, Governor, or a call to act?" The crowd gasped, the challenge sizzling in the air, like live electricity. She didn't wait for his breath, turning another page, with a motion sharp as a blade being drawn. Isaiah 58, she read, her hand raised high as if delivering a verdict. "To loose the chains of injustice, to share your food with the hungry." The line detonated louder than clapping, sharper than jeers. She drove it home with a scalpel's edge. "That's not socialism. That's scripture. That's why I fight for school lunch programs. Because when a child eats, he learns. And when he learns, he thrives." The audience ruptured into chaos, half clapping furiously, half booing. In rage, the divide splitting the room like an earthquake tearing concrete apart. Jasmine pressed harder, her momentum unstoppable. James chapter 2, she announced, her words hammering like a judge's gavel. "Faith without works is dead. The syllables struck like steel on steel. She pivoted her chair, staring past Huckabee and into the eyes of America through the cameras. That's why community healthcare matters, because faith that does nothing for the sick is no faith at all. She pointed directly at the lens, her eyes burning hot. That's why helping prisoners re-enter society is not weakness, it's obedience. The room detonated, whistles, shouts, applause, exploding together like a stadium teetering on riot. Huckabee lunged forward, his desperation boiling over. "But you still support sin," he bellowed, his voice raw, jagged, a roar clawing for control. His face turned crimson, veins bulging, his fist slamming the desk with a dull, violent thud. "You twist and turn, but you cannot hide from the truth. You defend what is wrong." The sound shook the studio, but his fury only exposed the cracks in his defense. Every time he forced his voice higher, the room leaned harder toward her. Jasmine didn't match him. She didn't need to. Instead, she smiled, a thin, sharp smile that carried more defiance than a scream. She leaned toward the microphone, her tone ice-cold, precise, lethal. "Abortion, 0 times in the Bible. Same-sex marriage, 0 times." She lifted one finger, then another, counting each word as if filing evidence in open court, but caring for the poor dozens of times. The crowd erupted like glass shattering against concrete, half rising to their feet in thunderous applause, half shouting with fury, the sound colliding in a storm of chaos. Cameras closed in on Huckabee's face, his fury raging but his power crumbling, while Jasmine sat calm, her smile holding steady, sharper than any blade. The studio was now an inferno, every breath thick with drama, every second charged with danger. And yet Jasmine stood unmoved, her calm cutting clean through the noise. In that moment, the debate had shifted forever. This was no longer a clash of politics. It was scripture against bluster, evidence against volume, truth against power. And as the audience fractured into chaos, one reality was undeniable: the war of faith had become a war of truth, and Jasmine Crockett had seized the battlefield. The storm of voices still rattled the studio when Jasmine leaned closer to the mic, her face calm, but her eyes sharp as steel. The tension was a living thing now, crawling through the air, pressing on every chest in the room. Huckabee had tried to bury her under volume and fury, but she chose a different weapon: clarity. Her tone dropped into a razor's edge, steady enough to slice through the chaos. Then she struck with words designed to wound, not just to answer. "Jesus never said," she declared, her voice crisp, echoing in the silence that followed the roar. "I was a corporation, and you gave me tax breaks." The words cut across the studio like a whip. For a split second, there was no reaction, just shock, the audience frozen in place. Then the wave came. Gasps, shouts, and cries collided, the crowd erupting as if someone had just detonated a charge in the middle of the floor. Hands flew into the air, half in outrage, half in thunderous approval. The sound was chaos, but the message was unmistakable. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. Jasmine leaned in again, her lips barely curling into a smile as she unleashed the next strike. "Jesus never said," she continued, each syllable like a hammer on stone. "I was a gun manufacturer, and you protected my profits." The reaction was instant, volcanic. The audience howled a split chorus of fury and awe. Applause cracked like gunfire from one half of the room, while the other half shouted in rage, their voices clashing so violently it felt like the walls might shatter. The cameras shook as operators fought to capture every angle of the explosion. The director cut tight on Huckabee's face. A moment earlier, his mouth had been curled into a preacher's confident grin, the look of a man certain he held the moral high ground. Now that smile faltered, stiffened, and finally froze. His jaw clenched, the corners of his lips twitching with strain as he forced the mask to stay. But the damage was visible, undeniable. The cameras caught it, the world saw it. His certainty had cracked, and the crack was spreading fast. The energy shifted like a tide pulled by a hidden moon. Just minutes earlier, Huckabee had dominated with booming sermons and pounding fists, drowning her voice under his weight. Now the tables had turned, the air itself bending in her favor. Every eye fixed on Jasmine, every ear straining for her next word, the studio transformed into her courtroom. Huckabee's roar was gone, replaced by silence that betrayed weakness. The crowd could feel it. The viewers at home could sense it through their screens. The momentum had shifted. The predator had become the prey, the sermon had become the cross-examination. Huckabee's authority slipped away under the glare of the lights while Jasmine's words rose above the noise like a verdict. The debate was no longer his to command. From this moment on, Jasmine Crockett owned the stage. The roar from the last clash still echoed when Jasmine reached calmly into her jacket. She pulled out a worn envelope, the edges creased from travel, and placed it on the desk like evidence in a trial. This, she said evenly, is a letter from a pastor in Arkansas, your state governor. The word Arkansas struck like a drumbeat, drawing every camera closer. She unfolded the page, held it firmly in her hand, and began to read aloud, her voice carrying the weight of testimony. Pastor Johnson writes, Jasmine said, her tone steady, her eyes locked on Huckabee. When our church partnered with the community to support men coming out of prison, we saw lives change. We provided training, small businesses offered jobs, and families welcomed them back. We saw fewer parole violations. We saw men stay out of fights. We saw fathers back at the dinner table instead of locked behind bars. These are not theories. These are real people who found hope in a ride to an interview, in a hot meal, in a landlord willing to give them a chance. Her words cut through the studio, not as argument, but as living proof. She paused only long enough to turn the page slightly, then delivered the final line, her voice ringing sharp and clear. We do this not for politics, but for Matthew 25. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that rattled the silence like glass about to shatter. Jasmine lowered the letter but did not look away from Huckabee. Her gaze locked him in place. Governor, she said, her tone quiet but devastating. Your own people are living the scripture. Will you say they are wrong? The challenge hung in the air, heavy as a gavel, striking wood. The camera zoomed on Huckabee's face. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed thin, his smile collapsed into stone. He tried to answer, but nothing came. He cleared his throat once, twice, shifting in his seat as if trapped in it. His hands twitched on the desk, searching for strength for a verse for anything. But the silence grew louder with each second filling the studio, like a verdict no jury could overturn. Jasmine folded the letter with deliberate calm, sliding it back into the envelope, as if closing a case. She had presented the evidence, and the evidence had spoken. Huckabee sat frozen, the weight of his own home state pressing against him. And in that moment, every viewer at home knew it. This was the knockout. The silence of Huckabee's collapse had barely settled when the real explosion began, not in the studio, but on millions of screens across America. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine reading the Arkansas pastor's letter was online. On Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, every platform ignited at once. The video spread like wildfire, shared in private chats, church groups, and political forums. What had begun as a debate exchange instantly transformed into a national moment. Conservative commentators were furious, their voices booming through talk radio and cable news. She hijacked scripture for politics, one host shouted. Others labeled it a stunt, a betrayal, an insult to true believers. Anger poured out like fuel on dry brush. Yet cracks appeared where no one expected. Prominent pastors, lifelong conservatives hesitated. On Twitter, Reverend Mark Ellis wrote, she quoted the verse correctly. We cannot deny Matthew 25. Another minister admitted on live radio, I may not agree with her politics, but the scripture she used is unshakable. Those words landed like tremors, splitting the ground beneath the movement Huckabee thought he owned. Mainstream media smelled the firestorm and poured gasoline. Talk shows ran the clip on loop, inviting guests to scream across tables. Podcasts dissected every second, slowing down Jasmine's delivery, replaying Huckabee's silence. Newspapers splashed headlines in bold, Bible becomes battlefield on CNN. Cable networks built countdown clocks, 72 hours since Jasmine Crockett's knockout. Every outlet had its angle, some praising her courage, others branding her dangerous, but none could ignore her. The story was everywhere, impossible to escape, and the volume only rose with each passing day. Inside churches across the country, the fallout was even sharper. Bible study groups opened dusty pages to Matthew 25 verses underlined, circled, read aloud with new urgency. I was hungry, and you gave me food. Congregations debated late into the night, some arguing Jasmine had shamed the faith, others whispering that maybe she had reminded them of what they'd forgotten. For the first time in decades, Sunday school discussions revolved not around politics, but around whether their communities were living out those words. Pastors who had sidestepped the passage for years now found it thrown back in their faces by their own parishioners. America itself shook from the impact. The debate clip didn't just go viral, it cracked open the conversation about faith and politics in a way no one had seen before. A black congresswoman armed with the very book her critics claimed as their weapon had forced the nation to stop and ask, what does the Bible really say? For conservative leaders, it was a nightmare. For progressives, it was a revelation. And for millions in between, it was a moment of reckoning. A woman who was never supposed to win had turned the entire religious establishment upside down, leaving the country staring into the mirror of its own conscience. This wasn't just politics anymore. It was a spiritual shockwave. When the clip stopped being a clip and became a call, Jasmine hit the road. She started in small towns where church bells still rule the hour and porch flags barely move in the heavy heat. Pastors met her at fellowship halls smelling of coffee and hymnals, their hands firm, their eyes cautious but curious. Veterans waited near the doors, caps bent with age, telling her which buddies never made it home and which ones did but never really returned. At the clinic trailers, community nurses unrolled blood pressure cuffs and asked if policy could travel as fast as an ambulance. At every stop, Jasmine tied policy to scripture, like a knot you cannot slip. She held up Matthew 25 beside school lunch programs and said feeding children is both mercy and maintenance for a future we claim to love. She paired Luke chapter 4 verse 18 with community health care and said freedom includes bodies healed enough to work, raise families, and sleep through the night. She opened Isaiah 58 and said breaking chains means re-entry training, second chance hiring, and landlords willing to sign the first lease, not the last one. She pointed to James 2 and said faith without works is dead, so budgets must move like beliefs put on boots. The South listened, argued, and listened again. Men in their 50s and 60s stood in church aisles and asked each other, have we forgotten the very words we taught our kids? In parking lots under sodium lights, voices rose, then softened as someone quoted his grandmother. Then another mentioned a funeral where the choir sang until sunrise. A veteran said, I bled for duty. Maybe duty now looks like jobs for men who lost years behind razor wire. Another man answered, if God measured us by who we lifted, not who we scolded, would we pass? Reporters began tracking small shifts, the kind that mean everything to the people who feel them first. A county board quietly restored a school lunch line, and attendance jumped before the rumor finished crossing town. A free clinic reopened on Saturday staffed by 2 nurses and a retired doctor who said he missed the waiting room prayers. A church formed a re-entry group and found the first employer before the first meeting ended, then bought steel-toe boots with the leftover offering. By week's end, Huckabee faced a choice uglier than either answer. Stay silent and look shaken, or attack and look cruel. Phones rang in Huckabee's world. Donors, church, elders, producers all asking, what will you say now? He drafted a statement, twice deleted it twice, and told aides the timing felt wrong. Radio hosts begged for a soundbite. Pastors asked for a sermon. Consultants advised a counterpunch he could not throw. Every option carried splinters, deny the verses, and lose the pews, embrace them, and concede the ground. So he waited jaw tight, watching Jasmine move state to state, while the story hardened like wet concrete in summer heat, and waited. The months rolled forward, but the echoes of that debate never truly faded. 6 months later, the network announced what no one thought would happen. Jasmine Crockett and Mike Huckabee would share the same stage again, live in prime time. The announcement alone sent tremors across the political and religious landscape. Commentators predicted blood, others predicted contrition, but everyone knew one thing for certain: this was not just a rematch, it was a reckoning. The countdown clock on the screen ticked down the final seconds as the studio lights roared back to life. Viewers across the nation braced themselves, wondering whether this night would reopen old wounds or finally bring resolution. Huckabee walked out first. His steps were slower this time, deliberate, not the thunderous stride of a man certain of dominance. He nodded to the audience, his face drawn but composed, no smile, no smirk, just a man aware of the weight of what was to come. Jasmine followed her presence, steady and unflinching, the same calm that had once dismantled his fury with surgical precision. She carried no papers, no notes, no Bible, only herself, as if daring the night to test her again. The air was tense, tight, like the hush before a storm that everyone knows will break. The moderator wasted no time. Governor Huckabee, he said, 6 months ago, the two of you shook the nation with your clash over Scripture. Tonight, America's watching again. What do you have to say? The camera cut close to Huckabee's face. For the first time, his eyes did not blaze. His jaw moved, then settled. He leaned into the mic, voice lower than anyone remembered. Perhaps he said slowly, each word chosen, like a stone laid on a grave. Perhaps Matthew 25 should be spoken of more in our sermons. Perhaps it deserves more space in our pulpits, more weight in our lives. The words hit like thunder, not because they were loud, but because they were unexpected. The audience gasped, not applause, not boos, just the sound of disbelief breaking the silence. Jasmine did not gloat, did not grin. She let the moment breathe, her eyes never leaving his. Then she leaned forward, her voice steady, rising with conviction. Faith, she said, is not measured by the words we use to condemn. It is measured by the actions we take for the least among us. The sentence landed with the force of a final blow, clean and devastating. It was not argument, it was definition. And everyone in the studio knew it. The words hung heavy in the lights, too true to debate, too sharp to escape. The studio shifted. People rose to their feet, not in chaos, but in unity, a standing ovation that spread like a wave. The sound was overwhelming, claps and shouts blending into one roar that shook the walls. Camera operators swung wide to capture the sight, strangers embracing, some wiping tears, others lifting hands as if in worship. It was not just applause. It was release, the exhale of a nation that had carried tension for too long. Huckabee lowered his head, his lips pressed tight, not in defiance but in surrender. Jasmine stayed seated a moment longer, watching, listening, letting the ovation belong to the truth itself. Beyond the studio walls, millions were watching. In living rooms, bars, and church basements, television screens flickered with the same image, a woman who had once been doubted, now defining the terms of faith on national television. And it was not just progressives who felt the weight. Conservative viewers sat quietly, some whispering to themselves, others staring into their Bibles. For the first time, Matthew 25 was trending not as a verse among believers, but as a measuring rod for an entire nation. Then the final image came, the one that would replay in countless retrospectives. In a quiet Arkansas farmhouse, a man in his 70s sat alone, the television's glow flickering against the wood-paneled walls. His hands were calloused, his Bible's leather cover cracked with decades of use. As the broadcast ended, he placed his hand on the book and whispered to himself, not to the camera, not to the world, "What have I done for the least of these?" His voice cracked and his eyes burned, but the question lingered heavier than any answer. Millions of men like him asked the same thing that night. News anchors tried to summarize what had just unfolded, but their words felt small. Headlines the next morning screamed about the confrontation's end, about Huckabee's concession, about Jasmine's moral clarity. But those were just labels. What had really happened was deeper, a shift in conscience. For the first time in decades, faith was pulled away from partisan slogans and placed back into the realm of duty, feeding, healing, lifting. It was not a policy debate anymore. It was a soul-reckoning broadcast in real time. The educational message was undeniable. Faith that condemns but does not act is hollow. Faith that shouts but does not serve is brittle. True faith, as Jasmine had carved into the record, lives and breathes in responsibility to the weak, the forgotten, the despised. It was not a radical message. It was an old one, ancient, written in red letters across pages that too many had left unread. And yet hearing it again, spoken plainly in the face of fury, felt like revelation. As the lights dimmed and the cameras cut away, America was left with the weight of that final truth. Not the thrill of spectacle, not the chaos of applause, but the haunting simplicity of a question whispered in homes across the nation. What have we done for the least of these? That question, not Huckabee's roar or Jasmine's restraint, became the true legacy of that night. It lingered long after the broadcast ended, long after the studio emptied, echoing in pews, dinner tables, and quiet prayers. And in that echo, a nation began to measure itself anew. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.